Well, as John alluded to, the timing of this is not ideal for UK-Russia relations, bearing in mind those renewed EU sanctions we're getting details of from Brussels. Let's talk about how Europe is developing its relationship with Vladimir Putin. Nina Schick is from the independent think tank Open Europe. Mary Dejevsky is a columnist for the independent newspaper and a former Moscow correspondent. Both of you, you're very welcome here on Global. What's your take on how Europe handles Vladimir Putin, Mary?
Well, I think the problem from Europe's point of view is that it seems so divided that each country pretty much has its own priorities. There's energy on the one hand, there's arms sales for France, there's the interests of the City of London for the UK. All these things place people at odds with conflicting interests, which means that when everybody happily calls for what we need is a united front, that's the one thing that they find it very difficult to get.
Well, obviously, yes, Mary's correct in pointing out that there's extremely divergent views in the EU on how to deal with Russia, and that's not only to do with economic considerations, but also historical and political considerations. Only look at the Baltic states, for example. They have very strong economic ties to Russia, but they're willing to take the hit, the economic hit, because they're scared of historical precedent and Russian expansionism. Now, when it comes to sanctions, if you say you're going to impose sanctions and then are not able to follow up with a clear position, EU position, as has been the case so far, then perhaps it's no surprise that Russia hasn't been taking the EU very seriously when it's been threatening to impose these further sanctions.
I think there's also, there seems to me to be some confusion about what this meeting on sanctions is actually about, because it was fixed and they said they were going to toughen sanctions in response to what was seen as Russia's supposed involvement in the downing of this Malaysian airliner. Well, since then, in the last sort of 48 hours, Russia has been cooperation itself. It's joined a unanimous resolution in the Security Council. It's done what it says it can to make the rebels release the bodies. The bodies are now on their way to Amsterdam. The site...
If Vladimir Putin had wanted that to happen a little faster, it might have done.
Well, he said actually on day one, which nobody took a blind bit of notice of, he said, I am prepared to cooperate with this, that and the other. And everybody assumed, I think wrongly, that Putin can simply sit in the Kremlin, snap his fingers, and the rebels in the east come to heel and say, right, we'll do what you want. In fact, there's very little evidence that Putin has an enormous amount of control over the rebels in the east. 4 days actually is not bad going.
And Nina, with reference to the Litvinenko case, the fact that this has been announced today, the fact that it's happening at all, is that evidence that the UK has perhaps given up on having a close relationship with Vladimir Putin?
Well, number 10 says it's just coincidental, but as the Kremlin advisor pointed out, it won't be seen like that in Moscow.
No, but frankly, they could have announced this any day of the week and it would have upset the Kremlin.
Yes, and there certainly has been a hardening of the UK position with regard to Putin's particularly boisterous brand of nationalism. And we saw that over the weekend when David Cameron made a statement in the House of Commons. He went very hard on Russia. He said that, you know, Russia indeed had a role to play in helping stop the pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine. And interestingly, David Cameron was actually more conciliatory towards Russia at the beginning of his prime minister's tenure. But now, given after the annexation of Crimea, the UK position has definitely toughened. And the UK has been, throughout this crisis, one of the hardest countries in terms of calling for sanctions on Russia.
Yes, well, not actually doing anything because it might harm the City of London.
Well, we've actually analysed, my organisation, Open Europe, has actually analysed the links of Russian money in the City of London. And yes, there is a lot of Russian money in the City of London, £27 billion. However, that only accounts for less than 1% of all European investment in the City of London. So the UK has said it's willing to take the hit, but it wants the other EU countries to step up to the plate. It won't take the burden alone.
And here's a last thought for the two of you. I don't want to do a lot of diplomats out of a job, but sometimes I watch how Vladimir Putin behaves and the decisions he makes, and I think maybe it doesn't make any difference what the other countries do and say. Perhaps this is a man who's just going to do whatever he feels is best for Russia.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. The extent to which anybody, including the West, because Russia has huge suspicions of the West's intentions, how far they can actually influence Putin. If he thinks he's acting in the national interest, well, that's what he's going to do. And indeed, any national leader would pursue that course.
Yes, and I think one of the problems with the EU sanctions is there is no ultimate end goal made clear. Does the West want Ukraine to become a member of the EU and or NATO?
I suppose the point is, if they held him tight, if they didn't introduce sanctions, if they tried to be as friendly as they possibly could, perhaps he would still continue on his own course anyway.
Yes, and obviously this whole crisis started because, as Mary correctly pointed out, Putin's extremely suspicious of Western ambitions in Ukraine, which is, of course, at his doorstep, and that will continue.
Good to talk to you both. Thank you very much indeed. That's Nina Schick and Mary Dejevsky live here on Global.